Is reason supreme? We're made of meat. How do we know anything? How can meat compute, evaluate, investigate, balance, interrogate? All these may seem to be very abstract and philosophical questions. I want to suggest that the answers may go a long way to enlighten us why some of our fellow citizens seem to ignore facts as they make decisions about who shall run the country. Ha, got your attention for that. Every year I go to the week-long conference on Star Island with the Institute on Religion and Age of Science, called IRAS. It's a vacation, but it's far from idle. I get a chance to do a lot of singing and music playing, and also hang out at stimulating chapel talks, lectures, and discussions, some formal and some in rocking chairs on the wide porch of the venerable Oceanic Hotel, the only Victorian-era hotel in New England which has not been substantially renovated and still retains its antique charm. The topic was supposed to be something called evolutionary epistemology. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy concerned with how we learn. But by the end of the week, I had not heard anyone give a definition of evolutionary epistemology that I could understand. So what follows is my own take. How do we know anything? What is it that does the knowing? What is this thing that I call Edmund, you call by your own name? Is it the same thing from day to day, year to year, hour to hour? A couple of weeks ago, when we were considering freedom, we asked whether there could be any freedom if everything amounted to the actions of the neurons in your brain. The reading we just did puts it in starker terms. How does matter, flesh, meat, achieve any knowledge of the world and of itself? The conventional answer the West has always given for 3,000 years is that there's something more than meat, something called the soul, or spirit, or mind, which is different from the body. On the cover of your order of service in the picture, the man who's often called the father of Western philosophy, René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650, was a mathematician as well as a philosopher. If you've ever drawn in a math class an x-axis across the bottom of the page and a y-axis up and down, and thus shown what a function looks like graphically, you can thank René Descartes. He came up with this idea. But he's best known for his trying to write an account of what is real and what can be known while disregarding everything that had been said before, starting from the basics. Thomas Aquinas of the Catholic Church had insisted that God had given humans the faculty of reason and then revealed himself through the Bible and the church. Those two ways of knowing, reason and revelation, were complementary, Aquinas thought. Descartes did not want to start with revelation, but asked the question, using reason, just pure reason as given, what can we know? And he came up with the famous saying, I think, therefore I am, or in Latin, cogito ergo sum. I can't be sure I know anything except the subjective experience that I'm in here, thinking. I think, therefore I am. There's the old story, probably not true, of Descartes on the airplane, when the server asks him if he would like a cup of coffee. Descartes replies, I think not, and promptly disappears. But seriously, Descartes' maxim amounts to saying, at least I know this. Thought exists because I know I'm thinking it. And if this thought of mine exists, therefore I must exist. And this would hold true even if the thought were a doubt. I could doubt that you exist, or God exists, or even that I exist, but those would all be thoughts which need to have a thinker, and therefore I, as a thinker, exist. Now, Descartes was important because he liberated philosophy from church doctrine. He and his near contemporaries, Leibniz and Spinoza, basically formed the rationalists. believing that reason was supreme, reason was the path to knowledge. In the next generation, the rationalists were opposed by the empiricists, like Locke and Hobbes and Hume, who said all knowledge must come through the five senses. And in the generation after that, Kant came up with a mega-theory of how we know anything which reconciled the rationalists and the empiricists. But Descartes is the focus of much scientific interest in the religion and science field because he insisted that the part that did the thinking was not part of the meat. The body was flesh, material. The mind was something else. This is what we call Cartesian dualism. Two types of things. There's the matter, and then there's this something else. But modern science does not have any use for dualism. We can't find traces of this so-called mind other than following the circuits in the brain. And that's all meat. But it feels real. Many of us wander for hours through the pathways of our mind. As I age, I become more fond of wool gathering, staring out into space while my mind skips around from thought to thought. I had a subdural hematoma in 2006 and underwent 2 surgeries at Brigham and Women's. Several weeks after the second surgery, I was in my surgeon's office in the hospital, and she was showing me a scan of my brain. I had to ask her, "Doctor, where's my soul in there?" She coughed and went on with her scientific Science is based on causality, on one happening causing the next happening in endless chains. The firing of the neurons is so fast, it would be impossible to actually keep track of them. But if there is thought, if there is memory, learning, ideas, principles, it is in those firings of neurons. Somehow we are each thinking me. Besides the soul and the mind, the other thing you can't see on an MRI is reason. We like to think we're governed by reason. The 18th century, when America was founded, was called the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment spawned not only science and universal human rights, but also, somewhat down in importance, Unitarianism and Universalism. All take reason as their watchword. Descartes was not an absolute idealist. He actually had a neural basis for his philosophy. He thought the body was material, but the mind was non-material, but mind and body interacted through a particular material piece, part of the brain, the pineal gland, a little thumb-sized body right in the middle of the brain. Through this gland, Descartes thought the mind could control the body, but the body could also give feedback to the mind. In 1994, a modern neurologist named Anthony Damasio published a book called Descartes' Error, in which he said the fundamental error which Descartes and philosophy since Descartes had made was to assume that thinking and feeling were two separate things. In the brain, there are structures like the amygdala, which is near the pineal gland, which are more primitive, and there are parts like the cerebral cortex, which is more advanced. But in the normal human brain, they are all interconnected and work with each other. As exhibit number 1 in his argument, Damasio discusses the 19th century brain damage case of Phineas Gage. Gage was a railroad foreman in northern New England in the 1840s, who was too near a dynamite explosion with the result that a large steel bar entered his skull. It did not kill him, but rather severed connections between his forebrain and the rest of his brain. When the wound had healed, Gage had most of his motor and cognitive abilities, but he was totally cut off from his emotions. He had no capacity to feel anger or grief or pleasure. His reasoning, however, was intact, but this had a curious effect. He experienced great difficulties in life because he could not make a decision about the simplest thing. If he were to try to decide whether to go to Boston by train or coach, he could make lists of the alternative merits of each form of transportation, but he could not evaluate the lists and decide which to take. Damasio shows that for normally connected people, emotion is always involved in the decision of every question we face. We may say we're deciding on the merits after a rational assessment of all alternatives, but in the end, it's usually our hearts that do the deciding for us, and the reasons are what we assign afterwards. Trial lawyers know this. We know that no matter how hard jurors try to put their emotions aside, as they're instructed to do by the judge in deciding a case, cases are usually decided on emotions. When someone comes to me with a major question in life, such as what shall I do with my life? Should I marry Mary or Sue? My counsel will often be, listen to your heart. Your heart is the one making the decision anyway, and the reasons you assign might only confuse your mind. I practiced courtroom law for 30 years. Our law is awash in the rhetoric of rationality, deciding the cases on the facts. But every human actor in the system has feelings about justice, and those feelings predominate. The best that an advocate can do is to try to tell the story so as to appeal to a particular set of feelings the judge or juror may harbor to ring that bell of reflex. On Earth Day 2 months ago, we talked about denial of climate change. Those whose wealth is tied up in fossil fuels have a powerful incentive to ignore the facts of climate change and to try to convince others to do so. While the interest of most of the public is to get cracking on solutions and remedies, the oil barons are going to see the world through the lens of their own interests, and they will convince others to see it through the lens of their own identity. In racial matters, we have built up an identity in this country called white. In 1984, James Baldwin wrote a famous essay titled On Being White and Other Lies, in which he argued that originally people coming from Europe, European countries, kept the identity of their original country. They were German or Irish or Polish. But somehow, through the influence of the peculiar American racial classification system, originally forged to justify slavery, these European immigrants assumed the primary identity of white. And those at the lower ends of the economic spectrum and educational ladder are now experiencing shorter life expectancies and see that the population of people of color, native and immigrant, will soon achieve a political majority. This is the genesis of the feeling we've lost our country. We have to take it back, meaning we've lost white supremacy. We have seen over and over in this presidential race how identity trumps facts with some voters. One of my great heroes in American history is John Adams. Not only because he was our second president, not only because he was an early Unitarian, not only because he was an early proponent of human rights, but because he was a crackerjack and fearless lawyer. Though his sympathy was with the Patriot side, he defended the British soldiers who had fired on Crispus Attucks and the other patriots in the Boston Massacre. And in his summation, he told the jury, facts are stubborn things. I love it. Facts are stubborn things. There are many cases in which the facts will virtually assure victory for one side or the other. These days, a lot of irrefutable facts about police encounters come from video cameras. But it is frustrating when a political candidate consistently lies, makes irresponsible claims that have no basis in reality, and yet poll numbers and attendance at rallies seem to go up and up. He seems to be speaking to a deeper level than facts. Really, he's speaking to identity there. In the time I have left, I want to give you a little taste of the Star Island Conference I went to in June on this issue of how we know. One of the big name speakers was a professor named Warren Brown from California. He submitted a paper taking off on Descartes' famous proposition and saying how he would update it in the light of what we now know about the human animal through science. Brown's paper was entitled, Knowing Ourselves as Embodied, Embedded, and Relationally Extended, unquote. As to the first of these, embodiment, The thrust of modern evolutionary psychology, which I think is congruent with modern liberal theology, is to insist that all ourselves or souls are fully embodied. It all comes from the meat. Well, Descartes had said, I think, therefore I am. Brown said, I act, therefore I am. He explained, what we refer to as our mind is grounded in interactive brain-body processes. The constituents of thought and mind are rooted in memories of motor activity and sensory feedback. Importantly, for the richness and intelligence of human thinking, this bodily experience includes speech interactions with other persons. A number of philosophers of mind, this is still Brown talking, a number of philosophers of mind have argued that even abstract concepts that would seem to have no particular embodied representation are metaphorical extensions of the bodily experiences associated with action, or at least begin that way. For example, the abstract concept of time is comprehended through metaphors based on movement. Time passes, we say. Time slows down. Time drags. Time rushes by, or time flies. Events are in the past, behind, or in the future, in front, etc. A metaphorical link to movement helps us grasp the abstract idea of time. From this idea, Brown goes on to pose a mind exercise I never thought of. Now put yourself in this frame of mind. Just listen to this. The implications of embodied cognition for our views of ourselves are interesting. For example, if I have a different body, I would have a different mind and a differently constituted self. Consider this. If you had the body of an elephant, but the same brain you would have a very different mind. Because mind is built through bodily experiences and interactions with the world. You would have built your mind through very different ways of interacting with the world. For example, with a trunk instead of with hands. Unquote. In other words, it's not just that somehow we're evolved thinking meat, but the particular meat is going to think in a particular way because of the way our particular bodies are constructed. Second, Brown contends that the self is not only fully embodied, but that it learns by simulating. I simulate, therefore I am. We can create whole epic dramas in our minds. We have evolved these things called mirror neurons. You ever heard of mirror neurons? They fire when we're undergoing an experience such as pain or happiness, but the same neurons will fire when we see someone else going through that experience. You're being attacked, and my neurons are going to fire the same way they would if I was being attacked. That's mirror neurons. It's the basis of empathy. Third, there is the situated self. I interact, therefore I am. Brown says embodied cognition also includes situated cognition. He explains, quote, this idea asserts that action and therefore thinking does not occur outside of a situation. Mental activity is always interactive with some situational context, immediately present or imagined. Thinking is thus contextualized action stimulation. For example, Brown says, as I'm writing this essay, I have a lot of thoughts going on in my head in the nature of possible sentences. If I stop and consider what I'm doing, I'm stimulating in my head saying these sentences to an audience. You, my reader, although you're at the moment a rather vague group. To think about what to write in this essay is to think about or simulate things I might say to you. And the process of typing the words is accompanied by an almost audible experience of my saying the words that I am typing to some vague audience. I used to do this myself. I used to catch myself in the shower in the morning as a lawyer, rehearsing all the speeches that I had to give that day. That's the way I think. I think by rehearsing speeches. In the interest of time, we will not pause to dwell on the relational self. I relate to others, therefore I am. Or the extended self. I incorporate, therefore I am. To move to the final manifestation of self, my religious self, which is described as We sing, therefore I am. Don't you love it? Brown explains that in the holiness tradition in which he grew up and in which he still participates, the Cartesian dualist model prevails. The soul is disembodied, and it will be saved or lost without regard to what he does in the community. But when he starts to think of his self as embodied, it all changes. Quote, for me, a lot changed in beginning to understand persons and myself as embodied, situated, and extended. If I am a body and not a soul hidden inside of my body, then a life of introspection regarding the spirituality of my soul is no longer on the agenda. Rather, I have to understand and know myself as an actor in the world. What is the nature of my actions? What motivates them and what are their effects in the world? And if I am an actor, I must also consider the context in which my actions take place. How do I tend to act in certain contexts? What are the effects of my actions on those contexts? How does feedback from those contexts shape me, my body self, as an agent? Most recently, I've begun to think about how spirituality is not the sort of property that can be attributed to me, but is something that extends into the community with which I worship and live out a Christian life. Let me give you that sentence again. Spirituality I've begun to think about how spirituality is not the sort of property that can be attributed to me, but is something that extends into the community with which I worship and live out a Christian life. The whole Christian enterprise is no longer inner and individual, but is active, lived, and shared. The best metaphor I can think of for such a life is congregational singing. We all do it together. And to the degree the adjectives spiritual or Christian or religious could be attached to the singing would be due to the nature of the shared endeavor. Such properties cannot be attributed to me or to anyone else present. These are emergent properties of the extension and connection of each to the other. These words will describe us, not me. Unquote. I don't know how much of that came through this turgid academic prose, but as we wrap up, you may well ask, what happened to the question with which we began? Is reason supreme? The answer, I think, is clearly no, but neither is it irrelevant. For Descartes, reason was supreme, but modern science's understanding of the self have put it as one influence among many. But I have the sneaky suspicion you all knew where I was going to end up. And that's because you not only see it in the great unwise who are going to vote for that horrible candidate, you see it in 1,000 ways in your own lives and in the lives of your friends. We know the reasonable thing to do. We know the right things to do. We know what science says to do. We know what moral consideration says to do, but we don't do it. We do what we think we want to do instead. We give ourselves some sort of reason. A Jefferson Airplane song from my childhood had a line, small things like reasons are put in a jar. But it's basically we do what we think will make us happy. George W. Bush trusted his gut in making decisions, ignoring the views, the reasonable views of all the Middle East experts in the government who said that an invasion of Iraq would be like throwing gasoline on a burning fire. Driven by testosterone, driven by hunger, driven by dopamine, driven by rage, driven by jealousy, just driven by fear. The things we say and do are driven by a lot of things, and occasionally by reason.